When we talked about de-Stalinization in Europe in the post-war period, we mentioned how the new leadership in the Soviet Union, now under the helm of Nikita Khrushchev, had outlined in a secret speech in February of 1956 a new course for the Soviet Union and for the communist world, which was tied to the Soviet Union at this time. And so this process was generally felt to be a de-Stalinization of the policies that had preceded Khrushchev's rule. And so the question was for Europeans who were living under communism is to what extent this de-Stalinization applied to them. Early on, you saw signs of pushback from European countries under communism when after Stalin dies in 1953. There are a number of demonstrations and incidents which occur which suggest that perhaps Europeans living under communism were waiting for the opportunity to start plotting for themselves a different course for their national political development. In 1953, for instance, the East German workers who were unhappy with the kind of imposed economic system that they were living under decided to protest against the government and against government policies which used a command economy model for running their economy. This was followed later in Poland by protests and demonstrations, again, against the economic conditions that had arisen and were making the working class very, very unhappy in terms of the production quotas that they had to face and also the scarcity of basic commodities, which they felt that should not be the case. But in any event, we see that the idea here is that de-Stalinization was already had some traction even before Khrushchev announced this his denunciations of Stalin and Stalin practices in the previous eras. And so the realization of whether this would then take communism on a new trajectory and one that would lead it far away from the practices that most Europeans were familiar with remained to be seen. So the first true test of this policy then, of the new course and of Khrushchev's, the new direction he may be taking the Soviet Union and communism, occurs in Hungary in October, November of 1956. And so that'll be the focus of our discussion today. We saw last time when we looked at Hungary the establishment of a pro-Stalinist regime under Matyas Rákosi. So he was one among several of the Stalinist leaders of the Hungarian Communist Party who ruled Hungary with a kind of an iron hand, in the sense that, again, he did not tolerate dissent. You might recall the Rákosi purge trials that occurred in this late 1940s. And so there was a general feeling inside of Hungary that communist rule was not going to be at all flexible. And even after Khrushchev gave his famous and kind of explosive speech, there was concern as to whether or not people like Rákosi would be receptive to that. In other words, to what extent would this new course really have an impact on his rule and what he was doing? Rákosi, while he was establishing his authority, he went in different directions with this. He did not stop at purging political rivals or dissidents, but also cracking down in society generally. The clergy, for example, religion barely tolerated in communist countries, certainly not welcome in countries like Hungary, were for the most part put under government authority and repression. Educational reforms were all aimed at eliminating any possible source of dissent. In other words, making sure that what was being taught in the schools or being published reflected the communist line as approved by the government. So all those things were becoming features of this Rákosi regime, which had been in existence for a few years, but now it's 1956, and again, he seemed to be out of step with what was going on in the Soviet Union itself. So once it became apparent that Stalin was no longer on the scene and that there might be changes afoot elsewhere, stemming from the Soviet Union's changed leadership, then people inside the communist movement in Hungary decided that it might be the opportunity that they'd long been waiting for, which was to start pressuring the government to move more towards a response to communist problems or issues that they were facing in this period. So basically what it did was it raised the expectations of those who felt that communism that had been established in Hungary was too rigid and harsh in form, and that perhaps there was another way of establishing socialism there, one which would follow more along the lines of Hungary's own traditions and customs. The fact that Rákosi was falling out of favor became apparent by 1956, shortly after this speech, in which the Hungarian Communist Party started to make moves towards liberalizing itself to a certain extent. And the first concrete indication of this was the dismissal of Rákosi as the head of the Communist Party. So it looked like Rákosi was so closely identified with that past that he was no longer in a position to rule the country from this point on. So he was replaced by a veteran of the communist movement, a man by the name of Giraud, and he was part of the old guard, but was not as closely identified with the kind of the harshness that the Rákosi regime had been identified with earlier. Other signs that things were starting to change a bit was the rehabilitation of sorts of some of the communists who had been marginalized in earlier periods for being too reformist-minded or out of step with, again, the Stalinist policies being pursued by the Communist Party. One of the notable figures here who was rehabilitated was Imre Nagy, who was readmitted to the Communist Party in 1956 and quickly rose through the ranks to become an important figure in communist affairs. But not just in the inner circles of communist activity did you see this development, but also among the general population, particularly in places like universities or in academies, and among the young people who were very unhappy with the tight rein that the Soviet Union was holding on countries like Hungary. An example of this is the Petofi Circle, which emerged in this period in April of 1956. And you see young communists there. In other words, these were pro-communists, but who had came from a different generation than the current leaders of the Hungarian Communist Party, and also felt like the Hungarian road to socialism ought to reflect Hungary's own history. And so even the name that they adopted, Petofi, refers to a hero of the earlier nationalist figures in the 19th century who struggled for Hungarian independence. And so they adopted this posture that Hungary could achieve communism or socialism, but taking into account, again, their own past and kind of shaping communist policies to conform to those rather than having to follow strictly the model that had been adopted from the Soviet Union. So this was the thinking among those who belonged to the Petofi circle and those who were sympathetic to their ideas as they were being expressed increasingly through publications or pamphlets or leaflets that they were distributing. Again, they were taking a chance here because the government itself was still tightly in control of the media, but their idea was to promote this idea, this course of action that went against Stalinism as it had been implemented in the immediate post-war period. Well, the momentum of this anti-Stalinist and pro-New Course movement came to a head in October of 1956 when it became apparent that the students themselves were ready to kind of rise up and express their dissent. In other words, they weren't going to be reined in on by the authorities any longer. And so on the 23rd, you see a peaceful demonstration coming about, public demonstration, and calls for empowering people like Nagy and other members of the Communist Party who were identified with this liberal trend. This then quickly devolved into more active protests, in other words, demonstrations that led to the tearing down of statues of Stalin and things of this sort, kind of a testament to their anger and frustrations with a system that they felt was foreign to their own circumstances. One of the demands that came or emerged in this period after October 23rd was to have the Soviets removed from Hungary altogether. In other words, they felt that their country was being occupied by the Red Army, and they felt that true socialism would not emerge unless Hungary was an independent country and one that was able to make its own decisions regarding its future. When this became apparent that the students, again, were able to do more than just form crowds, but actually to move against public monuments and things of this sort, then the police quickly moved in, particularly the secret police, the AVO, who were to identify the ringleaders of these protests and to arrest them and to begin the process of repression. So from the beginning, it looked as though it might have been a peaceful dissent, but one that quickly devolved, as I said, into a more confrontational type of situation that was the authorities responded to by repressing as much as possible dissent. But what the government of the day didn't reckon on was the fact that there were not just students who were upset with the affairs of state as they existed at that time, but also military, members of the military, and even some of the authorities who were not part of the secret police establishment, who felt sympathy for what the students were saying. So their messages resonated with a much larger group. And so they soon joined these demonstrations that despite the repression, were starting to crop up in different parts of the city and Budapest. And so you see now of the momentum starting to gain ground in this very brief period of time. One of the slogans that became popular in this period was "Russians go home." So the Hungarians, young and older generations alike, were now feeling bolder and bolder and ready to, as I said, to declare a greater independence from the control that had been exercised by the Soviet Union from the beginning of the Cold War on. Well, the authorities were not about to completely ignore these demonstrations and perhaps the direction they might turn. Undermining public authority was a very serious offense as far as they were concerned. The Soviets themselves decided to move in tanks into the middle of the capital of Budapest as a way of discouraging these sorts of public gatherings. And this then started the process of conflict that would result in casualties, mainly on the side of the demonstrators. In other words, as the tanks moved in and authorities became harsher in their crackdown, you see people falling victim to this sort of repression. However, these disturbances now were starting to, from a propagandistic point of view, were working against the interests of the established Communist Party, because it became apparent that the government now was turning its force against its own people. This is never a popular thing, and of course what this did do was to discredit the government itself, forcing Giraud to step down. Remember, he had replaced Sarkozy earlier, but they didn't see him as the kind of leader that they wanted in this period of unrest and uncertainty. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, the new figures became important leaders in the Hungarian Communist Party, including János Kádár, and most significantly this Imre Nagy, who had been identified with reformist currents in earlier periods. So Nagy himself was seen by the students and these protesters as kind of their voice of opposition, and they wanted him to take Hungary again down this independent path towards socialism. And so he took to the radios as soon as he could to let the people know that he was on their side and that he wanted to create the conditions for a new kind of establishment of a socialist regime. In other words, one that, again, did not resemble closely that of the Soviet Union. So he suggested all kinds of changes that might occur as this process of transition was underway, including the democratization of the political arena inside of Hungary, which is something that had been off limits up to this point as far as the communists were concerned. He also kept emphasizing the importance of giving communism the imprint of Hungarian history and customs, and he also tried to address the demands of the working classes, just as workers had protested in East Germany earlier and in Poland. He felt that the workers in Hungary were also fed up with the style of the command economy that had been imposed on them, and that he would do what he could to reform economic practices inside of communist Hungary. So the message here was one in which communism was still being upheld in its principles, but it was going to diverge from the path that had been laid out by the communists under the Soviet influence and domination. So Stalinism now seemed to be unraveling very quickly as this shift in power seemed to be occurring. By the end of October, it looked as though, again, that the reforming elements were in the ascendancy and that they were going to be able to carry out these sweeping reforms as soon as possible. Some signs of this change were when one of the prominent primates or clerical figures. Cardinal Mindszenty was released from jail. He had been imprisoned under Rákosi's regime, being a threat to public order through his religious practices. So all these things that were occurring now very in rapid fashion at the end of October suggested that, again, that things would soon look very different in Hungary than they did in neighboring communist countries. However, when Nagy got on the radio or in the public media a few days later, on the 1st of November, he announced even further changes, and these seemed to be much more challenging to the communist rule than any other that had been announced up to this point. And that was, he said that the recently formed Warsaw Pact defense network was one that Hungary would leave or withdraw from because it felt like it was not necessary to be a part of. And this was something that then transgressed a boundary that the Soviets and the hardline communists inside of Hungary could not abide. In other words, he had moved too far here to break away from the communist rule that had been established in the post-war period. And so it looked as though things were running off course here very quickly. In other words, maybe Nagy's real aim, as far as these hardliners were concerned, was to take Hungary outside of the communist world or orbit entirely, and they couldn't abide this. And so remember that one of the features of the Cold War early on was to set up a set of rules that both would follow and be consistent with. In that way, they would be assured of the stability of their regimes. Nagy went further in the same period by opening up the political arena to other political parties which were non-communist. So he's doing basically everything that undermined his position vis-a-vis these pro-Soviet and communist forces that were still very much entrenched, not just in Hungary, but in the Soviet Union. So this was the litmus test for Nikita Khrushchev, who had earlier denounced Stalin and his heavy-handed tactics, but now was faced with a real dilemma. In the case of Poland, where there had been uprisings, Khrushchev decided to let the Poles sort that out for themselves, and so he didn't move in Soviet tanks there to repress the dissenters, but allowed the Polish authorities to do that on their own. Would he do this in Hungary? Well, the answer came very swiftly in the first week of November of 1956, when the Soviets decided to move in their tanks in great numbers. This time they took their engagement much more seriously, so they moved through the streets of Budapest to crush all public opposition to the government and to, in other words, those who have been identified with this reformist or protest movement. And fighting then broke out between the two opposing sides, leading to kind of a bloodbath among those who wanted to change Hungary, as I said, along these new lines that we've outlined. Almost immediately, it was apparent that the firepower was much greater on the communist or Soviet side, and those who opposed them were certainly going to lose any direct confrontation they were involved in. Many Hungarians who, when the opportunity arose and were able to, fled the country as fast as they could. So several 100,000 people left in this period, fleeing the authorities, thinking that this was a lost cause and that once the government reestablished its authority, there would be a severe repression. And in that sense, they were right. So during the course of this melee that pursued or ensued between the communist supporters on the one side and those who were seeking reform on the other, several thousand people, perhaps close to 3,000, lost their lives. Nagy himself was able to escape and seek asylum briefly, but he was later betrayed and then turned over to the Hungarian authorities, who then would prosecute him for betraying the Hungarian people. So kind of a very sad ending to this uprising, in which the leadership, which was reform-minded, was deposed eventually with the once force had been applied to the demonstrators or those who revolted in Hungary. And in the end, people like Nagy, as I said, were rounded up and put into jail. Seemingly in an ironic way, the person who oversaw or presided over this repression was this János Kadar, who had disappeared during this time of intense protests I talked about earlier. He'd gone to Moscow and was given the directions from the Soviets to go back and to reinforce party control and to tamp down on all this dissent, which is what he did, which, as I said, cost the life of Nagy and others who were identified as the ringleaders of this liberal or progressive type of communist movement. It would take many years before Nagy would be rehabilitated and seen as a national hero instead of a villain, as he was portrayed in the press in this period immediately following the Hungarian revolt. But the reality was there. Hungary had risen up trying to seek a more independent path and had been rudely awakened by the repression that followed. And so Hungary was one of the first test cases here of this de-Stalinization, which suggested that perhaps things had not changed as much as people had hoped. One footnote to the Hungarian uprising that it's important to note here is the fact that de-Stalinization was put to the test in the case of Hungary, but it was also true that communists inside of the communist world, but also in Western Europe, took seriously the changes that were being undertaken by Khrushchev and his attempts to distance himself from that Stalinist past. And so it's important to note here that communist figures like Togliatti in Italy and others took very seriously this idea that communism could express itself in different ways. So despite what happens in Hungary, he still had a belief in the so-called polycentrism, which was announced in the secret speech by Khrushchev. And basically what this term referred to was this idea that communism could evolve in different ways in different places. It depends on, again, the historical background of the region where communism was establishing itself. This is something, again, the Hungarians thought was, they took literally but were disappointed in the outcome there when they tried to do that. But Togliatti, not discouraged by what the repression there so much, continued to insist on his public announcements or pronouncements about communism that this would be kind of a new start for communism in the West. In other words, it would allow them to distance themselves a little bit from the Soviet hand, allowing them a greater freedom of expression. And so he was going to remain loyal to communism as long as it meant giving them greater free rein in the West, which is how he interpreted Khrushchev's new course policy. Other communists, however, were less inclined to treat Khrushchev's speech as an opening for a more liberal interpretation of communist practices and policies. The French Communist Party, for example, was pretty much still a hard-line Stalinist type of organization, would remain so for many years. But there were others, including prominent members of the Communist Party in France and even in Italy, who saw what happened in Hungary as something that was wrong and needed to be denounced. And so they took this opportunity to leave the party and say that they, whereas they had supported communism in the past, they would not in the future. So the Hungarian uprising really did shake up the communist world in different ways, but also, as I said, it reaffirmed in the minds of those like Togliatti that communism was on the right track now, but that there were going to be bumps in the road, but basically they weren't going to abandon their cause, whereas others felt like this was a breaking point, that what had happened in Hungary demonstrated that there was not much in this de-Stalinization plan that seemed to be proposed by Khrushchev. But in other respects, you see some lessening of the reins, so to speak, in terms of communist or Soviet control over the rest of Europe. Khrushchev, for example, had a rapprochement with Yugoslavia to a certain extent. In other words, it wasn't invited back into the communist fold so much, but it was not harshly condemned and vilified as it had been in the past. So Khrushchev was kind of moving or lurching in different directions here. On the one hand, it looked as though he was going to pursue a Stalinist position when it came to reining in on dissent as it appeared in the communist world. But on the other hand, it looked like he was ready to give some flexibility to those who were willing to work within the confines that were being defined by the Soviet Union itself.